Okay, hi everyone. I'm Catherine Bowers. I have my goodness. Okay, this was kind of a whirl to get set up, but I think I'm just going to get started. So here we go. All right. Um, Thank you for coming to my Kaleidoscope presentation. My presentation is called Weird Topographies. I needed a title. This presentation is really about the experience of teaching a research methods class in the COVID-19 era. And what I'm really interested in with this presentation is the idea of just all the things that happen in this crazy landscape. And when I put the presentation proposal together, the idea of landscapes and fossils and everything like that seemed like a really clever metaphor. I don't know if it still is, but that's where that came from. And the other thing to think about is when I was thinking about like, is this like teaching for credit or teaching information literacy instruction or whatever it is? Somebody told me that the difference, the way to tell whether something is just a fossil or a rock is to lick it. And that was like weird and gross. And this whole teaching during COVID thing has been kind of the same. So anyway, I'm just going to get started. And I look forward to any questions you might have. So here we go. I taught a research methods class. It was an undergraduate interdisciplinary 3000 level class. And it is the fourth time I've taught this class. And so every time I teach it, I evolve, I grow, I become a better person, I hope. And what I wanted to do was really be intentional and think about all the different methods. And, since this is the fourth time, the dean who sort of oversees this class is like, you know what you're doing, you're fine, this is great. I really like teaching research methods. I thought everything would be fine. COVID-19, I thought we had it together because this was not taught during the pivot semester. This was taught after the pivot semester. So I thought it would be great. So this presentation is really about teaching the class, the experience of teaching during COVID-19, and also kind of the thinking about the class itself. And I've also been thinking a lot about metacognition and meta-literacy and how to bring those into the classroom. And even though this is a 4-credit class, I want to talk about why this all matters for library instruction and information literacy topics. So, okay, so like I said, the class itself was an undergraduate interdisciplinary research methods class. There were 12 to 13 students in it. Some students dropped. The students were a mix. Some were in the arts, some were in allied health, nursing and allied health sciences. Some were sort of more traditional liberal arts majors. So everybody was all over the place, which I think is actually fun because I'll talk more about that in a bit. And like I said, I taught this class before, but whenever you have sort of like an ungrounded class, it's always interesting to see what students take from the class and what they put into it based on where it's positioned in the progression of their major and so on. So as the semester carried on, it was increasingly difficult to see like if the students were struggling with the research process or the COVID stuff. And when I say COVID stuff, I mean like the stress of being in a COVID situation or so on. And also some students were really great writers, really obsessive researchers. Some were not, and some were just kind of, sort of floating. And that's actually kind of normal for this class, but it was just an interesting sort of landscape, again, with that metaphor. So, and once again, the class itself is research methods, and the way I have it structured is that over the course of the semester, they eventually build up to a research project, which is a written paper about 10 to 15 pages long, and they must collect original data. And the original data collection, I really emphasize because in the past, students just did literary review or lit reviews, kind of like what's in the scholarly sources and databases and so on. And one of the reasons I included that was because they're in different disciplines, and the research methods for that are all very different. And so I just wanted them to collect original data, whatever that meant. And I emphasize things like content analysis, so they wouldn't have to go through the IRB if necessary. And but I'll talk about that. And they also had scaffolded projects, and they also had to do a research presentation. The scaffolded assignments were built to help students see the components of research such as developing a topic and thinking about all the parts, including things like timelines and scholarly conversation and understanding data visualization and so on. And what I emphasized repeatedly was that I didn't want them to persuade me about anything. I really wanted them to be messy and really embrace the strangeness of research and if they ended up with a weird, clunky topic at the end, that's fine. I didn't want a polished paper if that was, if they had to sacrifice that. And I think that was actually probably more jarring. And I personally think that really aligns with the idea of research. And I know it's actually kind of a challenge to think about what they have to turn in for their classes. But again, I was trying to get them to think about research as a process, research as inquiry, research as all the different things we talk about when we talk about the ACRL framework. So, and I wanted to be a researcher within this class. And what I did was I just wanted to know what was actually happening in the class under the surface, especially because so many of my students were little digital ghosts that only lived in teams because the class was taught in a hybrid format. So I applied some scholarship of teaching and learning principles, namely figuring out who my students were, what do I want them to learn, wondering if my teaching is effective, and how will I know it's been effective, and if they learned, and so on. And so these things were, they were evident through different types of grading and different processes of assessment and so on. And it was pretty typical. But as far as who are my students, that was actually the biggest question because I didn't know them because so many of them came to class the first 2 weeks, and then when we had to go hybrid, it was and fully hybrid. I mean. I just didn't know who they were. They wouldn't speak up in class. They wouldn't, I knew they existed because they turned stuff in on the discussion boards, but it wasn't exactly, I didn't really know what their true strengths and weaknesses were until they started making strange comments about having to pay for articles, which was really just kind of touching something electrified and getting a little shock out of it. So, and then, of course, I integrated ACRL Framework components, and I also wanted to know things about the digital divide, as well as what students are working with, including things like knowledge base, technology, accessibility, and so on. And finally, I did a survey because sometimes you just have to ask questions. Okay, this is an example of a question I asked. I wanted to know, do they think their research skills improved? And obviously it was, well, maybe not obviously, it was an anonymous survey. They could have said declined. I wanted them to be, I think there were some things where I wanted a little bit more honesty in the survey overall, but I got some, a little too effusive answers, I think. I don't know if I actually trust it. But all good survey design, I put improved, declined, and I don't know. But I use this terminology too eroded, not because I'm a big geology fan, but because, some students did talk about just exhaustion, just the mental exhaustion, the heavy exhaustion. Maybe it's because they were a third semester junior, or maybe it was COVID. It's hard to know. But anyway, so I put that in, and one student said that she was too eroded to know for sure. And all my students were pretty good about this, and I think I had a 90% response rate overall. Okay, so as far as the efficacy of scaffolded assignments, one of the things I really wanted to do is take a sort of macro look at what we have. And the first is a research matrix, which if anybody has ever done a review of literature, you've probably seen before. But it's just like a systematic type of form, and this is just an Excel spreadsheet. And I didn't want to emphasize the checklist or scavenger hunt nature of trying to find 3 academic articles and then a media website or something like that. But I did kind of guide them, and I only had them to choose 5, and I wanted them to find how to build a citation, where was the website so they can go back to it. What were some of the keywords or main themes? And some of this was probably a little bit much for them, But, I just wanted them to look at each thing and kind of like piece it out individually so they could do their annotated bibliography and eventually their lit review and write their paper and so on. And I also, like, I'm a huge fan of podcasts, especially, like topical ones. And there's a huge, for anybody who listens to podcasts probably knows, there's a huge offering of podcasts with the content creators who cite their sources and have like a reading list or have a wiki or something like that. So in this particular case, my demonstration topic was vaccine hesitancy. And in each particular case, we were looking at, what is, vaccine hesitancy? And, some of the things are like, well, who does this problem affect? And so in this particular case, this particular episode of the Sawbones podcast was talking specifically about people in West Virginia. This other article was talking about, people who are professors who are working with African American populations and Hispanic and Latinx populations around the country, and just kind of like looking at all the different ideas, because as anybody who's worked with undergraduates knows, sometimes what you see are things like, well, I just need to find the top 3 articles that prove my point. And so, but instead I wanted them to get messy, and I wanted them to find something that they didn't start with. And we talked about that throughout. And also I had this research plan. This I was super proud of, because I am terrible with time management. And I was like, this is it. This is genius. I just need to reflect on this. And also, I'm really interested in the concept of bullet journaling. And, that kind of, it's almost like a metacognitive sort of planning, like, what do I need to do in order, it's kind of like, and also like SMART goals, I guess, is another way to look at it. But like, what do I need to do and how will I know I got there? And so this is just a version of it. And so I just wanted them to go through like every single thing they need to think about. Do I need to spend money on this? And then, like, am I turning in a project just like this for another class? What am I stressed about? And so here we're diving a little bit into the affective domain. But that'll come up in just a second. And also things like I wanted to like seed ideas, like, do I know how to get books from other libraries? So in case they didn't pick that up when they had library instruction, which was given by one of my colleagues and not me, because I believe in amplifying messages, so I just wanted them to think about this, like, am I doing quantitative or qualitative? And just doing all these like little tiny steps. And how do I know if my project is ethical? So I wanted them to really look at this, and also especially when we talked about original research, look at the idea of inquiry. And does this project pass the Wikipedia test? And this was the one that I really wanted to talk about and this is the thing that I like to bring into library instruction also. And the Wikipedia test, as we talked about in class, is, does this research project address a question that I cannot answer by looking at Wikipedia? And so this was a thing that happened. A lot of times students were, they would start with a topic, and one student was interested in the history of dragons. I'm like, well, okay, that's interesting, but dragons exist around the globe. And so eventually, like, she took her topic and worked with it and edited it and came with like a super, super amazing topic. But like, we were talking about like the difference between Wikipedia and to be fair, other tertiary sources that sort of like give a broad overview, but like, what does your project add? And that also led us to the question of what is original data and why does it exist? And so I had these others, and I'm not going to talk about every single thing that happened in class, but I do want to point out that, again, I love using podcasts. And some of the topics we came up with were things like original questions that affect everyday life. I think a lot of students hadn't heard the song 99 Problems by Jay-Z. And this article I heard about on NPR a couple years ago. So obviously target college student demographic. But it was just a law professor going through and unpacking whether Jay-Z's analysis of his experience with the Fourth Amendment and a police search was actually accurate accurately reported according to various Fourth Amendment cases. And also these questions like, how old is Winnie the Pooh? And so that goes into a whole thing about like analyzing different types of expertise. This one was about a professor who took her own experience of having an unusual and stigmatized name and sort of doing a deep inquiry into an ethnographic method of students who also have names that are considered, possibly stigmatized or outside the norm and their educational experiences with it. So anyway, so all these things just kind of tied into it, and the students seemed to like it and so on. Students really hated the idea of working with the news because they, when they have a topic, they're not especially interested in how long people have been talking about it. They seemed very distanced from like the rhetoric of the topic. Even if the ones who did work on a COVID-19 related topic, they're like, no, COVID-19 is this totally new thing that happened, and we can't research it effectively because there's no information about it, which wasn't true. I mean, there are plenty of scholarly peer-reviewed articles that got pushed through, peer review, and we know that. But it was a really interesting situation because they really didn't like it, and I think it was, if I had to guess, it was because they really didn't like using the news databases that I asked them to use. But that's the other thing. And also they did have some topics, like, for example, the student who was working with dragons, there's not a lot of dragon coverage or dragon beat in the newspapers, but they made it work. So also the other thing that they worked on was research ethics. And all the topics, and these are all the topics they chose themselves. There were a couple others, but basically that was really positive, and they all seemed to like it. They had to give a presentation, which they were allowed to do online. And they talked about things like the ethics of like misrepresenting data, whether like, for example, the Nazi data that was discussed repeatedly, even in things like Operation Paperclip, if that was ethical to use, and even if it was actually accurately gathered, and other types of case studies such as David Reimer and ARCA. So there are all these things that the students, I thought, were really interested in. They enjoyed them, and they did their own original research and talked about why it was a problem. And they also talked about their emotional reactions, which I thought was great. Okay, so survey question. And so all these scaffolded assignments were things about the discussion boards, and which ones did they enjoy, or did they think they benefited from? And they liked the ones at the beginning of the semester. They didn't like these other ones as much. And so I thought that was interesting. What I found interesting was that they really liked the topic development ones, but that was also where the students seemed to struggle the most. Even just like landing on a single topic, which was to some degree kind of a commitment issue, especially if they were allowed to do anything as long as they collected original data. But anyway, and also the other question I wanted to know about was the idea of barrier to information, which is, part of the framework and so on. And I didn't talk about information privilege specifically, but it was something that came up, especially because there were one or two students that just seemed to like not get the idea that there were articles that existed that they did not actually have to pay for. And that was frustrating at an information literacy level. It was frustrating as a professor level. We talked about this multiple times. And I don't know what it was. They were not specifically using any of the sources that we can't get, but it was just kind of wild. So anyway, and then they said there were barriers, and then like some of the barriers were things like developing keywords. And I know that that's not exactly what the framework refers to when the topic of barriers comes up, but it is part of the idea of like, if I can't figure out what I'm asking about, what am I actually, like, how do I actually work around that? And some students said forming a survey was hard, but testing it on friends was really helpful. So that was good. Okay, so this was my face during a lot of teaching. Mostly because, and like I talked about, some of the students were researching COVID-19, and it was so traumatic for some of them that for various reasons, like a lot of them lost their jobs. And they took this topic that they felt really passionate about, or they had to do all their classes online and they didn't like learning online. And they took this topic they were passionate about, and they had a difficult time thinking rationally about it in many ways. So for example, one student wanted to learn about online learning for nursing students, and her concern was like, this is not good. How do we do this? And I said, what you need to figure out is developing a timeline. Were students doing online nursing school before this? And it was just like this big crater, it was hard for them to understand the depth of a lot of their questions and how it wasn't just specifically COVID-19 that was necessarily impacting this, including things like the digital divide, or students who live like out in the country and don't have access to the internet in the same way. So that was a big thing. And a lot of them, there's a lot of interconnectivity, and they were just like really stuck. And of course, also these things happened without COVID-19 as an impact. The other thing was that technology, it was seamless for me. I like teaching online. It's fine. I've been doing it for a long time. But I went to like 18 billion webinars, and they were like, try this, try this, try that, et cetera, especially if you have a hybrid classroom and some of your students are in person and some are not. When I went, the class was supposed to be face-to-face, and within the first week of class, 3 students had been exposed and they needed to quarantine. So we eventually went to a hybrid model, which meant that I would teach with Teams on, and also students were welcome to attend, which also meant one student attended almost the entire semester, and all the other students were online. So it was a weird balance. And also when I, was trying to do like Google Docs or breakout rooms or something like that, a lot of students were like, well, I'm on my phone, or I'm on my iPad, or I changed my work schedule. And so like they couldn't participate for various reasons. And also the other thing I found out was that the student opportunities for training, and this sort of blew my mind, was they got a link to, like, some of their professors would make links about how to use our LMS or how to use Teams or something like that. And of course the problem was like professors have very idiosyncratic ways of using it themselves. So that was a problem. And I'm sure this is not news to anybody else, but like it was just stunning that very few students at my institution, or the institution where this class was held, were like if they knew about it, it was because they'd been exposed to it previously, and there were very few ways to catch up with a lot of, kind of like a seamless online learning. And then also a lot of students just like, even if they had like a basic familiarity of where to upload stuff, there were things like they didn't know how to do a presentation, or they didn't know how to adapt the Excel spreadsheet, for example, to make sure like the cells looked normal and were usable and so on. So it was a lot, and it was actually, I don't want to say a trip back to the ACRL standards, but it was actually a very interesting conversation I had repeatedly with myself about what to do, okay? And so student perceptions of hybrid classes, I'm not going to go over all these things, but the students, like, they're like, oh, I really like technology. It was great. It was, et cetera. And then some students were like, well, the professor like did a good job of calling on all the students, but not all the students answered because they were obviously only logged in. Or so there was some tattling, but it was very interesting. They thought they were doing great. And then, but then of course I asked a follow-up question, and I said, well, what advice would you give? And it was all about things the professors were doing wrong, not about things that, maybe students could improve on or something like that. And it was kind of, it felt accusatory, I'm not gonna lie, but it was a very eye-opening question. Okay, so again, I went over some of these problems already. And so faculty practices, essentially, a lot of students just kind of don't know, because the students were not invited to have like an overall top-down framework overview like the faculty were for Teams or Desire to Learn or anything else. So, so again, also with technology, some students just like don't like it. They don't use it very often. They're, they don't know, they don't have like a basic set of skills that, and so some of the situations, like I wonder about this, like, do we have to have library programming about this? Like, should we pollinate more tech issues in LibGuides just as like another area for contact? And so these are the things I was thinking about. And I've told everybody who will listen that students need to have more opportunities for training. It needs to be more centered, et cetera, because like realistically, a student could be using Teams, they could be using D2L, they could be using GoView. These are all things that are library issues, because we need to know how to do library instruction. We need to be able to answer student questions, kind of besides respond to lockdown issues, et cetera. And so, there are ways to do this, and I've been spending a lot of time brainstorming, and I'm going to work on that over the summer. So finally, and I know I'm running over, but, oh, I totally did not finish the slide. Okay, so the idea about metacognition and meta-literacy is really what brings me into like kind of concluding all this. Metacognition is essentially thinking about thinking, but it's also being aware and being critically analytical of like what you're learning while you're learning it. And the example I keep coming back to is for people who've learned Spanish. the idea that there are two different verbs for to be often blows people's minds. And so they have to, like, when they're speaking Spanish, when they're learning, even for like the first couple of years, they have to like think, they have to go through a Rolodex of decision making, like, how do I know I'm using the right verb? Is this a ser or is this an a star situation? And some of the some of the decision making criteria is not entirely logical to an English speaker, or to speakers of other languages and so on. And so that's what I think about. Like, you think about what you're thinking about. You're thinking about learning and so on. And this is, Fulkerson and Jacobson and others have written a lot about the idea of connecting metacognition to threshold concepts, and so on. And meta literacy is the idea of, is tied to metacognition because it takes in cognitive, behavioral, and affective domains of learning, which are things we've heard about through what's his face, the pyramid. I'm sorry, it's 3:30. I'm kind of running low. But anyway, also we have, and the metacognitive is just the idea of like bringing all that in. So meta literacy is also very emotional. And so you think about it, and you think about the topics you want. Like, so when we're thinking about COVID, a lot of the students who had COVID related topics for their papers, again, they were very emotional about it. Other students had like emotion related papers, but the COVID was different because it was so immediate. It was right there. And also meta literacy is important when we're talking about web stuff. And so when the students were using non-scholarly sources, like some students said, no, I didn't use any non-scholarly sources, which is actually really frustrating because I asked them to use a lot of non-scholarly sources. And so some were like, yeah, I used a blog. It was great. It was really helpful. And then so in other questions, they followed up. And so finally, where students struggled, I've mentioned this before, but I just want to kind of recap. And so this is kind of the questions of like, this is metacognition, this is, meta literacy issues. They had a hard time choosing topics because it was, maybe a commitment issue. It was like they didn't want to have like some sort of, they didn't want to get bored, and boredom is an emotion. So anyway. They had problems narrowing and broadening their topic. Again, we see that all the time at InfoLit. Understanding the scope and depth and understanding the timeline. One student in particular had a paper about people who had intellectual disability or educational disabilities in the criminal justice system. And the student refused to use any documentation that used terms like mental retardation or some of the earlier terms that were not intellectual disability or anything else. And she said, no, they're wrong. And I said, no, they're just old. That was the term. And, you can't, you can't pretend like all this stuff didn't happen. And so it was a really interesting discussion and dynamic about, things like keywords and change over time. And it was, I understand being passionate about it. And that's, again, kind of like a meta literacy issue. Like, how do we understand like these kinds of challenging bodies of information and so on? And also one student turned in kind of a very disappointing paper because she didn't get nearly as many survey results as she wanted. And she wrote the paper, like, this is not a good paper. And I was like, whoa, you still have all this other data. So anyway, and finally, a lot of students really struggled with the idea that they needed to prove something with research, like they needed to make an argument. And they did need to make an argument, but they could have started, with collecting data and doing documentary stuff and so on. All right, so I'm running way over, so I'm just going to skip this. They really like talking about research ethics. That was great. Totally would do that again. And that would definitely be something to bring into the class because research ethics is about data collection and using data and so on. And that's a really good thing to use in InfoLit. And so where students really got it right, though, was when they found a topic they could really, really be passionate about and really dig into. And almost all of them had something that they were connected to. One particular wanted to do, she wanted to start with like the witchy TikTok and like crystals and stuff like that she was really into. But she had some like cultural resistance to that. And also, so she just adapted her topic to talking about the algorithm and like why TikTok was giving her stuff that she didn't know she wanted. But anyway, and so they did all sorts of really good things. They really nailed, most of them nailed their data collection. So anyway, that part was great. And that was actually really good to talk about interdisciplinarity. And so finally, these are the things that the students really liked and what they would take with them. Data visualization, which I didn't have a chance to talk about. And so anyway, so they did like the idea of the planning. They did, they wanted to do the research plan. And I thought that was very helpful to hear because, somebody said nothing felt like busy work. And as an instructor, I was like, this is a dream come true because, everything was purposeful. And I was very glad to hear that. So finally, all of these things are library instruction topics because they are, it was meta literate. It challenged concepts and perceptions. We can understand why students don't want to use non-scholarly sources. We talked about all sorts of things like information privilege, like why information on their topic might not exist or why they may be asked to pay for it, even though they actually don't have to if they talk to a librarian. And all these things are very, just kind of, important in the classroom, and we can amplify the things that are happening in the classroom in the library instruction. So I will conclude with that. And I think that is it. So. And I think I'm the only one on this panel, so.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. It looks like we have a comment in the chat. I've had to deal with that problematic historical terminology, and it ended up coming up with a statement about searching with it is okay versus using it in class.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, it was actually what surprised me was how resistant the student was to it. And I understand that the student never disclosed like if it was something that they were personally affected by or anything like that, but I said, no, this is the thing. This is the history of it. And I personally think that in many cases, such as this one, where there is limited information on the topic generally, like talking about that terminology was really illuminating for me personally, but also it's a good thing to put in your research method because they were struggling with finding a lot of legal documentation. And they actually did a really good project because they did a survey, they did a couple interviews with law enforcement and a couple other people in their in the circle. And it was something that it turned out to be a very good project, but it was a big, when somebody says, oh, there isn't anything on my topic, like this is a legitimate problem. And, and one student was talking about aesthetic sports, which in this case was like cheerleading, dance, and other types of athletic, other types of athletic engagement where, body image is important, but also the consideration that athletes are being graded or judged on like their makeup and things like that. So it was that was really interesting too. And she never would have landed on the idea of aesthetic sports on her own. So she did some digging and found it. So.
Yeah, Catherine, we have an attendee that has requested to interact live. So Jill, if you want to ask questions in with your voice or camera on, you're welcome to.
Okay.
Please.
Hi. Yeah, I'm the one who made the comment about the historical thing. I'm a historian and a librarian, and I have taught an honors course on the history of dating, which is actually a primary source literacy course. And they don't know that. I mean, I call it that, but they have to pick a topic between 1940 and 1990. They have a lot of range, and this is an issue. And sometimes it's a serious issue in terms of if they're talking about race, you might, and if they're searching in newspapers, you might see Negro, you might see harsh words like faggot, there's lots of things. And I actually, the second time I taught it, I was so serious about, be careful about this, that one student who was writing about positive representations of male homosexuality came to my office and was like, is it okay if I search using the word faggot? And yes, and we actually turned around and looked up at the New York Times, and who knew there was a play called The Faggot about, wood. But I mean, what I had to do was, because I did have an issue with the first class of somebody making rape jokes, was like, what's acceptable to say in class and what's not. And also that history can be very ugly. And if you are searching particularly in a newspaper database, you may find yourself needing to search with the ugly terms. And we are not going to use those terms in class unless it is clear that we are using it in that historical context, because otherwise it's offensive. And so, I mean, I taught the whole class from a LibGuide, and there's like a box saying history can be very ugly. This is how we're going to use the language. But for some of them, especially if they were talking about, and I mean, those are the serious ones. I had one student who wanted to write about polyamory, and I was like, well, that wouldn't have been a term between 1940 and 1990. And I had a meeting with each of them to kind of go over keywords. And so in his case, we were sitting here going like, okay, swingers, e-parties, and he actually found for one of his primary sources a print book in our unweeded collections about non-marital sexual relationships. And I was, it's a scholarly book from the 1970s. That counts as a primary source as far as I'm concerned. But having, but that process of having, okay, well, that wouldn't have been a term that would have been used. Let's think about some other terms that you can maybe get started with, and you're going to find more as you go. But that issue of as soon as you said that, it was like, oh yeah, the problematic term that could still be useful, but it's got to be contained, because you can't, for exactly the reasons that your student brought up. It's like, this is not right. And it's like, it's not. But nobody was going to say this term back then. And that's unfortunate. History's ugly, but it's still a search term that you can use.
Exactly. I'm so glad you brought that up. Because also in this student's particular case, they were also, I don't want to say reluctant or averse, but it was one of the challenges I had working with her was also she was reluctant to kind of contain what she was talking about. Like, was she talking about like in sort of a broad terminology, like, sort of low IQ or like neurodiversity or, and so, and when you use a term like intellectual disability, it's like, well, it's, and so, and like, I've had this question before with a student was researching fake meat. And we're like, well, are you talking about like lab grown, or are you talking about stuff that's like, like a bean burger, like that we all know isn't meat, but it's like, so it's, but yeah. And so I think like, to me, this is, and I kept enforcing, it's like, this is why I'd like you to be messy about your topic.
Right. Like, exactly. That's what my class was too. That it's, it's like, this is pre-research. You're finding 10 things on your topic. They don't have to be connected. I just want you to see what happens with, and I had to smile when you said that, because one of my friends from grad school wrote her dissertation on intellectual disability, a history dissertation on choices whether or not to institutionalize. And so, I mean, we were all finding references to imbeciles, idiots, this terminology that she knew that really was, taxonomies, and it was awful. But, that was language that she needed to be able to use. And we were all, every time we used to joke about it, every time we'd find, I was writing a 19th century poetry. Okay, Janny, here's another reference to an idiot. We'd sort of laugh about it in a sort of a dark humor kind of way, but it's like, but that's the language. And so for them to have to think messily about it when you're starting, you kind of have to, and then use that to kind of narrow into, well, what is it that I am talking about? Am I talking about, what is feeble-mindedness? What is mental retardation? And how do those go together, and how do they not?
Yeah, and I mean, even then, like by the whole thing about like the criteria, like, does the criteria we use then still exist? And we could just talk easily about the Carrie Buck case and so on, and just like so just like all the things that go into it. And I don't think the students were that interested in it, but I was like, this is so cool, because what you can do is this. And so and that was great. So thank you so much for affirming that, because I was like,
I definitely said it. Okay. And if you work it properly, it's a great way to get them thinking about keywords and subject terms, like controlled vocabulary. Like, that wouldn't have been a word, but this might be a word. And like, how do you map those together?
Yeah. I mean, like, I do that, like, that's just part of I do that automatically when I do nursing, because nursing is my liaison area. When I do like a nursing LI, I'm like, yep, let's talk about Sentinel, let's talk about mesh. And then,
mesh,
but she's in an allied health, but I don't think she's a nursing student. So that just might not have gotten there. But also the same thing with Eric. Like, if we looked up, mental retardation and Eric, it would have said use this instead, and so on. Right. But, it was, and then also, that's the other thing, is like, you talk about the history of words, and I mean, like, I didn't want to distract them, and be like, all right, let's talk about the history of the etymology of this. And then so, but yeah, so anyway.
And then their eyes start going.
I know. Well, that's the other thing is, when like a couple of the students were talking about COVID topics, and they're like, students are so stressed out that they won't get jobs after COVID. I said, I wonder if students were stressed out before COVID about getting jobs after graduation. They're like, no, probably not. And I was like, are you sure? So, and I, again, like searching newspapers, I had a student a few years ago when I taught this class saying something like campus sexual assault is a new problem that nobody's talking about. I'm like, I don't
No.
think so. And so that's when I really kind of like laid the hammer down, like searching in newspapers. I was like, let's see how far back you can go. And but anyway, so yeah. Thank you very much. Did you have any other questions? Because like I love talking about this class because like it's so it's fun because like I said, I am free to do whatever I want, but also it can be very frustrating at times. So.
I just want to add that I had the same thing with the COVID. I was teaching an African American Studies methods course right at the time of Ferguson. And so they had to be told not to do Ferguson because there's not enough written about it yet. And so the way I sort of demonstrated that was like, we're still in the stage where all the four sources that are being created are primary sources, or not two secondary sources yet, not enough time. But also, you know, I asked them just to think about like how keywords and subject terms evolve. Like how many of you had heard of Ferguson before August? And, you know, two people would raise their hand and I would say, how do you know? Then it would be because they were from St. Louis. And then they would stay after class and we would talk because I grew up in Ferguson and we would pull up Google Maps and see how far apart we knew and stuff. But it was a really interesting way to do it because that professor had actually said you can't. There was a cutoff date for topics they could choose that fell before Ferguson for that reason. But it was a great opportunity to talk about the scholarly communication cycle. It's not there yet. And if you were wanting to write about that, I would be pushing you towards historical sources about racism in St. Louis. There is one book about North County that was published before this, and I can't know that because I'm from there. But I mean, it was the same kind of thing. It was like you can't. It's not like this invented racism. You know, you used other ways of talking about it before this was not the moment or one of the moments.
Yeah. So
I'll stop talking now.
No. Like, well, I mean, I'm technically not supposed to say because for the survey, I use Google Forms and not Qualtrics. So technically this has not been fully exempted by the IRB, but this is kind of like the end of my research for this. Yeah, so I just taught it this past semester. So there's plenty that was scholarly and peer reviewed about COVID-19, about students learning in COVID-19. And so that was actually a little bit of a hindrance because they're like, well, I don't have to like look at time, or I can't be bothered to look at like any kind of thing on like Medium or InsideHigherEd.com or whatever. And so it was a weird sort of place because there was plenty. But also it was fun because when I was working with some nursing students, I found something, an opinion piece from Dr. Fauci written in March 2020. And so we were like, let's talk about this. And then so that, I don't know, it was definitely an interesting time. And the student who was working, oh my gosh, the student who's working with dragons, bless her heart, her research, this is another exciting thing. Her research premise was, do people's like first exposure to dragons, like is their first dragon, like how does that impact the rest of their life? I'm like, that is a study that is just one of these life's unanswerable questions. And it was interesting to me because her list of dragons were all from video games. I said, I have no idea what you're talking about. So it was an interesting way to talk about like what happens in an abstract and what talks, and so like when you're looking at data selection and data construction and, research methods, I said, well, the only people who are going to answer this are going to be people who know the dragons that you're talking about because they're going to see your list of dragons and just kind of like, just go. They're just going to close that survey and you're going to have incomplete data. But anyway, so it was fun. It was great. So that's all I really have to say. But thank you for attending my presentation. And if anybody else has any questions, I would be happy to answer. So, oh my goodness. Oh no, it's a high school joke from St. Louis. So anyway,
Catherine, are you familiar with St. Louis, knowing that the high school jokes or asking where you went to high school is a thing?
My in-laws live there. So, and my husband was born in St. Louis, but he grew up in Kansas City. So, and he considers Kansas City home, but his brothers consider St. Louis home. So,
Yeah.
so yeah, but I knew about that. I knew the whole like, well, where'd you go to high school? And then there's like the whole like, oh, I went to this like fancy Catholic high school, and then other people like, well, I went to this other cool high school. So, oh, you're
Mm,
on mute, Jill. So,
okay. Yeah, for me, it's that I mumble because I went to not a good high school.
okay. So no, it's funny to me. And also what at what Mobot, Missouri Botanical Gardens, one of the indoor gardens I really loved had a balcony from a Catholic high school that was dismantled or demolished, sorry. But it had this really beautiful brick balcony that they put in, and it was in the exotic plant area, the rare plants, rare and endangered plants. Anyway, so yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, do you go back to St. Louis often?
Which one of us?
Any of you St.
My
Louisans?
parents have retired back to where they're from in Wisconsin, so I haven't been back to St. Louis for a while.
Oh, oh, shout out to the St. Louis Zoo. One of my favorite in 2019 was kind of like the best year of my life because I everywhere I went, I got to go to a different library, and St. Louis Zoo has a really cool library.
Oh,
So, yeah, and you can just kind of wander in and be like, can I look around? And they're like, I guess if you want. And so it has, as you might expect, it has like some teaching stuff and teaching resources for like the science communicators and so on. But it also has a lot of veterinary stuff, as well as habitat management. So it was, that was a lot of fun. And also this is my jam, and, at every, kind of like anniversary or birthday or Christmas or whatever, my husband always gets me animal art. So for my birthday, he gave me a hippo painting, which was art made by a hippo at the St. Louis Zoo. So, um, but anyway, so
Nice.
that is, yes, I highly
Thanks for
recommend it.
presenting today. This was great.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks to especially Allison and Amy Barker, who got me the the right link. And I don't know what I did wrong. I went to the presenter training and everything. But anyway, thank you again. I hope to see you all at a future Glitter or DLC event. So have
Thanks,
a great day.
Catherine.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Hi, everybody.